Hello everybody, my name is Arglin and welcome back to Polybridge 2. Today we're going to be doing a half time-lapse and half commentary video. The first half is going to be just commentary, and the second half of the video is going to be a time-lapse. I wanted to do it like this because I wanted to provide you guys some context before I actually start building in the level. So the level we're going to be tackling today is from the workshop, which is called Scheduling Conflict by Shimojelfed. What's going to happen is that A1 drives forwards, stops at checkpoint A1.1, gets lifted up, drives back to 1.2, comes back to 1.3, then comes back down and reaches its flag. The same thing basically happens to A2, it just needs to go down and then come back up. Now for A1 alone or A2 alone, you can actually do this very easily. But of course there is a catch to this. If we go to the level info, you will notice that there's only one hydraulic phase and both A1 and A2 have to go at the same time. But the unfortunate part is that only one of the Vespas can go at a time through this small middle gap. And the solution to this is to figure out how to partition the hydraulic phase into two halves, each half going to each Vespa. So let's go to the sandbox mode. Okay, so we're now in the sandbox mode, and on the right we have a 4-bar parallelogram linkage. I'm sure you guys have seen this plenty of times. On my left though is called a crank rocker mechanism. If we simulate it, the parallelogram linkage basically takes the two shorter beams and lets them rotate at the same rate. On the left side, the smaller beam is rotating around its axis, and then the green bar, which is larger, rocks back and forth. Now, if I place multiple of these crank and rocker mechanisms to bridge the gap between a parallelogram linkage and a crank and rocker linkage, then you get something that looks like this. And as you can see, the closer the green bar becomes equal with the red bar, the more the crank and rocker mechanism acts like a parallelogram linkage. And if you get it really, really close, it basically acts like one for about half the time before it goes back to being a crank and rocker mechanism. Keep that in mind. Now we're going to go into something known as coupler curves, where basically if you add a triangle on top of this crank and rocker mechanism, you get a weird path. And they can come in a whole bunch of different shapes, like this one, or this one, or this one. There are quite a lot of them, and I found an image online which categorizes it into 12 different types. I don't know whether or not this is the 12 types. I am not a certified mechanical engineer, and I haven't taken any engineering classes yet, so correct me if I'm wrong. Now, if we put a coupler curve on top of a parallelogram linkage, you get a circle. But then now, what happens if you put a coupler curve on a crank and rocker linkage that acts almost like a parallelogram linkage? Well, you get something that looks like this. Now, if we go back to the circle, which is made by the coupler curve for a parallelogram linkage, you can kind of imagine that there is a center to that. And if we put a link there, you can see that the joint just stays in place, even though there actually isn't an anchor point there. Now watch what happens when I connect that link to the crank and rocker linkage. You can see that around the area where it's very close to matching the path of the circle, the axis doesn't really move. But once it starts to deviate away, then the white bar begins to get pulled along with it. This is known as a dwell linkage. A dwell linkage is kind of self-explanatory. It's a linkage where one of its links just dwells. Hey, it's Future Arglin here, and I just wanted to actually bring something that I forgot to mention until right now, which is basically that clan linkages, which are a type of walker mechanism, use this type of dwell linkage system. And basically what happens is that it takes a grasshopper linkage and then turns one of its bars into a virtual axis, basically. and I've just marked this out in red, but you can kind of see where this bar is that is kind of dwelling up until a certain point, and then it just lifts up and then comes back down. And here in orange, you can see the grasshopper linkage that is basically in there. Anyways, back to the main video. Now, this kind of dwell linkage can actually be made not only out of circular arcs, but straight line linkages as well. And I think that'll be a lot easier for us to work with. So here I have my little linkage repository that I keep. Link is in the description if you would like to check it out. And this is a Chebyshev lambda linkage, which is basically an approximate straight line linkage. And if we put a Petecellier-Lipkin linkage, which we know is a perfect straight line linkage, it mostly follows it. Though because I made the Petecellier-Lipkin linkage on anchors, it's just going to break once you reach the non-linear section. But instead of putting on anchors this time, let's put it on Petecellier-Lipkin linkages. So as you can see, the yellow Petecelliers lift up and drop down, and then they dwell for a little bit, and then the cycle repeats. Now, I just needed to find any type of linkage that had an approximate linear section, and then it can do whatever it wants. The lambda linkage technically works, the only problem is that it just doesn't really give that much height, and we needed to find another linkage that could do better than that. So I went out experimenting a little bit, and eventually I found this linkage, which is just a contra parallelogram. And when you let it run, as you can see, it kind of makes this pill capsule type of shape with two semicircular arcs on each end and then a roughly straight line section in the middle. This is actually kind of similar to the Chebyshev linkage, it's just that the links are a little bit modified so that it can actually go around the full way. Now we only really need a quarter of this whole path, so our starting point will be here and our ending point will be right here. The halfway point is somewhere roughly there. And in the first half, you can see that it's mostly flat, and then in the second half, it's, nowhere near. So I just built a second one, which in this case is in yellow, and what it does is that it erects itself as the red one flattens itself out. Now, before we continue going on with any of the dwell stuff, we just need to reinforce this linkage, because it's actually kind of unstable at certain areas. The contraparallelogram, when it goes into a collinear state, can actually pop back into a parallelogram linkage. Though that's not particularly difficult, all you have to do is just brace it like this. So all I did was just re-implemented that into both contraparallelograms. And there you go, it's pretty much done. Next, we're going to have a reasonable power source. And currently I've just arbitrarily placed the hydraulic at like a slanted angle, and honestly, we can do better than that. The green bar in the middle that's actually being pulled travels 45 degrees, and there wasn't really a consistent way of doing this on grid for quite some time, but about a month ago I actually started experimenting around with this, and I came up with a lot of different designs. This is just one of them that I came up with. This pushes a Petecellier-Lipkin linkage downwards 2 meters, and it just slides into position pretty much like that. I'll be adding this to the linkage repository very shortly to explain roughly why it works. But anyways, I just added it to the linkage, and as you can see, it works pretty much just fine. So the final bit that I had to do was just use the dwell linkages that I already made from the previous demonstration with the lambda linkage with this one. And here's the final result. This is the entire engine that is going to be powering our bridge. So now that we have this full engine complete, there's nothing else left for us to do other than to just begin the time lapse. Enjoy. So that pretty much concludes this video on Polybridge 2 Overengineering. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, and if you'd like to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe. My name is Arglin, your local Durable Poly engineer, and have a wonderful day. Much love. Bye bye.